I'm very excited. I think this is the largest crowd that we have had since before the pandemic. So every time that happens, I feel like it's a milestone that needs to be acknowledged because getting back to normal. And what better subject than Italian cinema in America for this first lecture. I am Luca Somigli, the Goggio Professor of Italian Studies, and my task today is simply, as I said, to welcome you, to remind you that we will have a short reception or a small reception after the talk. So please feel free to stop in the department on the second floor for some refreshments and some conversation with our speaker. And last but not least, my task is to introduce Professor Alberto Zamberletti, who will do a much better job at introducing our speaker today. So, Alberto.
Thank you. Can you take your mic?
It's all yours.
Thank you. Hi, welcome. My name is Roberto Zamberletti. I'm the Associate Chair Graduate of the Department of Italian Studies and the resident film historian. And it's a true pleasure to welcome you today and to welcome my friend and colleague Damiano Garofalo, who is also a film historian, but a new film historian. A film historian that employs methods and techniques to probe archives and reveal things that might have been overlooked by other historians that have focused primarily on sort of textual analysis and reading. So we're very, very excited to have him here today and to share his scholarship with him. I'm going to read a brief version of his bio. Damiano Garofalo is an assistant professor in cinema and television history at Sapienza University in Rome. He has a BA in historical studies, an MA in contemporary history, and a PhD in cultural history, which he received from the University of Padova, with a thesis on the history of early Italian television audiences. He has worked in many universities as an adjunct professor at the University of Padova, Udine, Modena, Reggio, and Cassino, and the Catholic University of Milan. And he has been a postdoctoral researcher between 2017 and 2019 at the University of Milan. He has been a visiting lecturer at McGill University in Montreal, where he was just before he arrived in Toronto to give some lectures. And he was a visiting scholar in 2019 at the Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. He has been associated with a number of research projects that are funded through the European Union and also through Italian institutions. If you'd like a list of those projects, you can see them. You can read them on our website, so I'm going to shorten your biography just a little bit, because I'd want to focus on the talk today, which is called from Damiano's latest book, which is by the same title, C'era una volta in America, or Once Upon a Time in America, which of course is a nod to a very famous Sergio Leone picture. And I've had the pleasure to host Professor Garofalo in my course yesterday. I teach a course on Italian Neorealist cinema, and he has spoken about Neorealist cinema in a way that I think was very novel and very helpful for my students to understand context and the way in which Neorealist cinema traveled abroad to the United States and also, of course, to Canada. I'm really thrilled to welcome him today to this community and to hear a bit more about his scholarship and about his new book. Please join me in welcoming Damiano to Canada.
Thank you so much, all of you, for being here, and thank you also, Professor Alberto Zamberletti, as well as the chair of the department, Luca Somigli, for the kind invitation, and I also thank all the colleagues here for such a warm welcome, and I'm really truly honored to be able to present my research today at such a prestigious occasion, such as the Goggio lecture. And as has been mentioned, I recently published this book, for now only in Italian, on the history of the distribution and reception of Italian cinema in the United States. And the talk I have prepared will attempt to give an account in a very concise way and through some case studies of the main outcomes of my research. And this will be, of course, a very partial point of view, but I hope it can be an effective overture to even convince you to read the book. The primary aim of my research was to understand how, through cinema, a certain image of Italy has spread historically in American culture. Soon I realized that studying how Italian films have circulated historically in the United States would have a broader significance. First of all, it meant having to analyze the changes related to the diffusion of foreign films in the United States. Secondly, to study the way in which special circulation spaces and circuits for non-Hollywood cinema, the so-called art houses, namely niche distribution circuits that develop as opposed to mainstream theaters, are established in the post-war period. Lastly, to question the relationship between high and low, between art cinema and popular cinema in a continuous perspective of negotiation between a cultural and even an industrial approach. In other words, I realized that studying the distribution of Italian cinema in the United States would significate, above all, understanding how American culture and the US film industry changed after World War II, partly by virtue of the spread of Italian cinema. As sources, I work mainly on the press, trade press for professionals, film magazines for cinephiles, newspapers circulated in large cities for general audiences, but also weekly or monthly magazines for intellectual elites. As an approach, I try to bring together a cultural point of view with a mostly industrial approach, trying to hold together culture and market, the study of critical reception with that of distribution. And the research already done on the circulation of Italian and European cinema in the United States between 10s and 30s suggested that I focus on the phase immediately following, thus from the reopening of a transatlantic cultural channel in the post-war period. This is even because during the fascist period, after all, communications between Rome and Los Angeles had officially ceased, formally resuming after the end of the war. And 1946 is also the first step in the circulation of Neorealist films in the United States, which inevitably begins with one of the most important films in the history of Italian cinema, namely Roberto Rossellini's Roma Città Aperta, 1945, which arrived in the United States in 1946. And this will be the first of the three cases I've chosen, and I'm really sorry for students who already heard about this part yesterday, but then I will come with a second and a third part that would be new for them. So let's take a look at how the film arrived in the United States, how it was distributed and how it was sold and promoted, and finally, how it was received by critics. On the evening of February 25, 1946, at the World Theater in New York City, a small hall of just 299 seats just off Broadway, Rossellini's film had its American premiere. The World Theater has been showing almost exclusively prestige foreign film, mostly European, for at least 10 years. This is an alternative weekly programming to that of the theaters of the mainstream circuits, which show mostly Hollywood or at best independent American productions. The word cinema is what is referred to in technical jargon as, of these years, art houses, independent movie theaters outside the major film company circuits that screen foreign films and that are frequented by New York's intellectuals elite who want to stand out through a more elevated viewing experience than that offered, for example, by mainstream markets. So when we are referring, for example, to the word foreign films, we are mentioning the foreign language films, so all the films that are not shot in English. So British cinema, even if it's foreign language, it is not a foreign language film because are shot in English. Open City is distributed in the United States by two personalities already involved in the American film industry. The first, to the left, is Joseph Burstyn, a Polish Jew who has emigrated to the United States, working as a public relations representative for the Yiddish theater circuit in New York, and who has recently specialized in the distribution of Soviet films. The second to the right is author Meyer, a 60-year-old American from Alabama, which experienced in Paramount's publicity department, who in the post-war period organized military film operations in the area of American-occupied Germany, and who in those years managed the Rialto Cinema in New York, that is as well an art house film theater. The two know each other, have been working together for a few years, and both are friends with an American serviceman stationed in Rome named Rob Geiger. You can see him to the left, and we have Roberto Rossellini to the right. Geiger, a few months earlier, had met Rossellini during the filming of Roma Città Aperta. The English title of the film is Open City, and decided to help him finish the film. Geiger, in fact, had pledged to buy the American distribution rights for between $6,000 and $25,000. After closing the deal with the director and embarking on another film project with him, Geiger took a leave of absence from the US Army, returned to New York with a copy of the film in his duffel bag, registered the name of a small production company, Foreign Film Production, and contacted friends Burstyn and Meyer, asking for help in arranging the American release of the film. So the adventure story of Open City's arrival in the United States is the starting point for the invasion of Italian cinema in the United States. And according to Variety, Open City is the first foreign film in the US history to exceed $1 million in box office. In New York City alone, the film remained at the War Theater for 2 years, then moved to other theaters in Manhattan and to theaters in more suburban parts of the city. In June 46, after 4 months of showing, an estimated 150,000 New Yorkers saw the film in theaters. By the end of its US distribution run, after reaching Chicago, Washington, and Los Angeles, among the other cities, the film grossed close to $5 million, settling in first place among the highest grossing foreign films in US cinema history at the time. So, how is the film sold and promoted to American audiences? First of all, through an extraordinary promotional campaign, which in some ways sets the standard for all the other Neorealist films distributed thereafter. If the original title directly recalls Rome protected city, Roma Città Aperta, that is a military status during World War II, the American translation instead leverages a universal libertarian spirit, open city without Rome, generically evoking an unopen city where everything could be allowed. So in line with this new meaning, promotional activity pushes a highly sexualized imagery of the film. Meyer's experience as manager of the Rialto Cinema, which at the time specialized in exploitation film, thus commercial exploitation, appears decisive in this sense. Meyer himself, in order to promote the film at its premiere, suggests that altered photos of the film be circulated in the American press. One, to the left, shows 2 young women, the characters of Ingrid and Marina, involved in a rather ambiguous embrace. Another, to the right, exploiting the famous torture scene, shows Manfredi's character being whipped. These are 2 important scenes in the film, but still marginal, I think, in the economy of the film's meaning. Nevertheless, the erotic reference to an assumed lesbian relationship between the 2 characters that is never explored in depth in the film, and as well the scene of violence, never too explicit and almost always off-screen, are here exploited for promotional purposes. And the primary circulation of these images in a promotional key allows a greater attraction for a certain type of audiences, acting on an intertwined plane between eroticism and sadism and distancing itself from the historical political sense in which the film primarily acts in a domestic key. After all, similar promotional strategies will be adopted by almost all distributors who from now on purchase foreign films for the American market. However, while in the first few months the film was screened mainly within art houses and independent theaters. In the second phase, Mayer and Burstein cut some scenes deemed potentially more offensive, for example, the torture scene, in order to secure the censorship visa necessary for first-run cinemas and allow some screenings in mainstream theaters as well, and consequently, the achievement of a sizable box office result. But not only the audiences, but also the American critics are enthusiastic about Open City. The first published reviews insist a great deal on the question of authenticity, opening up a debate on the realism of the staging. It is reiterated that everything seen in the film recounts events that really happened, recorded at the time of their historical manifestation, that the actors are the most part non-professionals, or at least taken from the street. In addition, the humanitarian question is placed several times under the magnifying glass, transforming an apparently local or at any rate national affair into a universal story. It is interesting to know, I think, how in the antithesis between Italian Neorealist films and classical Hollywood movies, we can trace the problems of the main characteristic elements already identified by one of the most important scholars of the relationship between American and European cinema, such as Thomas Elsesser. And these are elements with which European cinema establishes itself in the post-war period in the United States, namely a realist aesthetic figure accompanying the staging of art films. Secondly, the production character intentionally constructed in open opposition to Hollywood films. And third, the distribution of these films through niche markets, so the so-called art houses. And Open City is the Trojan horse by which Italian cinema arrives in the United States, and the primary vehicle for these processes of institutionalization of neorealism, to quote a formula by Chris Wallstaff, that will contribute to the entry of Italian film culture within a global cinephile canon. In the months and years that followed, dozens of neorealist films were released that would follow the same circulation and reception patterns as Rossellini's film. Here, for example, you can see, I show this slide yesterday, and here you can see three publicities, advertisements from three different neorealist films like Victor Reis, Riso Amaro, Bicycle Thieves by De Sica, and Miracle in Milan, where you can see the use, for example, of this kind of hypersexualized images of female actresses to sell the films to the American audiences. And in all these cases, if you remember, especially Bicycle Thieves and Miracle in Milan, you do not have anything about these sexualized images inside the films. So it's kind of a promotional key to sell the film for the American audiences. And on the promotional level too, the campaign organized by Burstein Mayer for Rossellini's films set up the standards that would later be adopted by most of the European films distributed thereafter. On the one hand, critical merits and aesthetic qualities are emphasized, with particular reference to the radical break from classical Hollywood cinema. So realism, the question of authenticity, humanitarianism, and things like that. On the other hand, verbal and visual suggestions are relied upon, the sexualization, violence, which, while risking to distort the cultural universe of reference of the films distributed, and end up directing the gaze of American audiences toward more sordid, immoral, and even disturbing aspects. So through this double and complementary articulation, American audiences transpose a specific idea of post-war Italy. And the recognition of neorealism as a national cinema, particularly from the point of view of cultural legitimacy, was sanctioned in an opposite and certainly higher direction by the Academy Awards. The introduction of an honorary Academy Award for Best Foreign Film in 1948, with the victory of Vittorio De Sica's Shusha, and the transformation of this award into one official category as of 1957, with the victory of the Oscar once again for an Italian film, Federico Fellini's La Strada, decreed an undoubted recognition of Italian cinema. In the post-war period, the second only to British cinema, with which, however, there is a linguistic proximity, which is why we speak of foreign language film. To date, the country that has won the most Oscars in the category of Best Foreign Language Film, which has now become Best International Film, as you know, is Italy. 14 awards won in this category out of 32 nominations. 33 if one considers the nomination for Garrone, Io Capitano, coming from last week, followed by France and Japan. Only 6 directors, moreover, have won the award in this category one more than one occasion. 2 of these are Italian, Vittorio De Sica and Federico Fellini, 4 each. And this brings us to the second case. I choose that of Federico Fellini, and especially to La Dolce Vita, which was released in the United States in 1961, giving rise to what Tino Palio has called the second Italian Renaissance, after the circulation of Italian Neorealism, of course. In the same year, and only a few months apart, in 1961, Fellini's La Dolce Vita, Visconti's Rocco and His Brothers, and Antonioni's L'Avventura were released in American theaters. By 1961, Fellini was already a well-known director in the United States. By the time La Dolce Vita was released, Lo Sceicco Bianco, I Vitelloni, and La Strada, which, as mentioned, won the first official Oscar in history as Best Foreign Film, had already been released in the US market, all in 1956, followed by, the next year, by Le Notti di Cabiria, Nights of Cabiria, also awarded in the same category in 1957. So after a fairly canonical European release, in April '61, the film arrived, La Dolce Vita, at the Harry Miller Theatre in Manhattan. That is a Georgian-style cinema theatre opened by Harry Miller himself in 1918. After the media hype that accompanied its European release, one of Manhattan's most beautiful and luxurious theatres was chosen for the American premiere, with a capacity of nearly 1,000, built with abundant use of marble and gilding, and with a huge crystal chandelier descending from the dome ceiling, as you can see from the picture to the right. La Dolce Vita is purchased for the US market by Astor Pictures, a former distributor for exploitation film and B-movies, which decides to relaunch itself by engaging in the circulation of foreign films. And the distribution organized by Astor follows a precise commercial line. The film is presented following the classic roadshow mode, that is, a limited release, thus in a limited number of copies in the main theaters of the country's most important urban centers. It starts in New York, and then goes on to Boston, Washington, Chicago, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and slowly extends, depending on the theatrical hold, the distribution radius throughout the country. In these theaters, Astor organizes a reservation system with reserved seats, higher prices than regular screenings, and an interval between 2 times, all typical features of the roadshow distribution. The promotional campaign works mainly through advertisements aimed at local distribution, published in magazines, newspapers, and national television channels. In terms of content, it directly recalls the promotional strategies already used for Neorealist films in previous decades, while also exploiting the controversy the film generated between Rome and the Cannes Film Festival, where it has had its premiere. For example, the rhetorical element most frequently resorted to is that of shock. The fact that the film was subjected to censorship cuts in Italy thus represents an incisive promotional vehicle, but the real innovation introduced by Astor is the decision to distribute the film in a subtitled version, even in theaters outside the art house circuits. As a Variety article from the time reports, thanks to La Dolce Vita, viewing a subtitled film becomes an acceptable practice, even within mainstream circles. From a box office perspective, La Dolce Vita is an incredible success. As it happened with Open City after the usual circulation in art houses, the film is also booked by commercial theaters on mainstream circuits that not only do routinely program foreign films, but would never have purchased a subtitled film. In early 1966, the film is released for the first time in an adult version earning an additional $8 million at the box office. In total, the film grossed $19.5 million in the US theaters, ranking first among foreign language films distributed in the United States and maintaining that position until the end of the decade. 1962 is the year of ultimate legitimacy for La Dolce Vita, nominated for 4 Academy Awards: director, original screenplay, set design, and costumes. The film wins only the latter. However, Fellini's film is not nominated in the Best Foreign Film category because it was originally not chosen by Italy, probably with the idea of trying, I think, to win in multiple categories with 2 different films. The critical reception is also largely positive. However, there are 2 recurring elements that draw our attention. Controversies, it is true, are more or less discussed by all critics, but they remain a rhetorically preponderant theme for the promotional aspect. The majority of reviews, in fact, recurrently address 2 issues, distinct but complementary. Firstly, Fellini's connection with the tradition of Italian cinema and Neorealism, and thus the rediscussion of his authorial status in relation to his predecessors, like, for example, Rossellini, of course. Secondly, the representation of the city of Rome, often considered in open opposition to Neorealist imagery. And in both cases, there is a great deal of focus on the search for possible characters of nationality in the film, thus on its presumed Italianità. Fellini's authorial status in the United States is constructed, above all, in relation to Italian cinema of the past, thanks in part to the director's direct involvement with the origins of Neorealist experience, particularly his collaborations with Rossellini. Not coincidentally, Neorealism takes on the contours of a true critical category through which to decipher in opposition, as in proximity, the style, the mise-en-scène and content of La Dolce Vita. So it is exactly in this moment that Neorealism became a critical category through which American critics used to read and critic Italian films, and I can assume that it is even now still a critical category. So if you used to read several critics coming from American magazines, American press, for example, Italian contemporary cinema, you will surely find the term Neorealism inside the articles. So this operation clearly proceeds from the analysis of an actual presence of Neorealist characters within the film, but operates on the level of cultural legitimation. Thanks to such rhetorical simplification, critics can thus increase the film's prestige, ideally placing it alongside its progenitors in an ideal pantheon of Italian film history. Alongside this perspective, in 1961, we see the publication of dozens of articles by American reporters who, following the film's release in the US theaters, traveled to Rome to investigate the existence of the real Dolce Vita. Almost all of these pieces focus on the city's fascination with moral decadence as depicted by Fellini in his film. The depiction of a perturbing, morally problematic Rome, in some ways post-Neorealist Rome, but in any case never seen in cinema up to that time, is one of the main characters of Italianism through which the film is received. At the same time, it is Neorealism that is the critical category through which this new phase of the return of Italian auteur cinema to the United States is interpreted. Both of these elements, on closer inspection, are also constantly used in a promotional key, aggregated by the rhetorical element of the shock, which in itself broadens the foreign film's target audiences. So as you can see to the American poster, the most talked about, the most shocked film of our years. The most interesting aspect, I think, is precisely how this apparent divergence between American critics who reason about the film using categories proper to European auteur cinema and the promotional strategy implemented by Astor Pictures, which succeeds in annihilate the boundaries of the art house circuits, allowing the film a cross-sectional distribution and a commercial success never achieved for a foreign film, act in a threefold complementary direction. First, to renew the image of a cinema that, in the second part of the previous decade, was losing its grip on American audiences and critics. Second, to complicate the idea of Neorealist Italy and Neorealist Rome, reconstituting a new national imaginary based on worldly, exotic, cosmopolitan, even transnational logics. And finally, to protect the ambitions of foreign cinema within mainstream circuits where commercial logics and authorial looks no longer move into irreconcilable territories. In the face of such an operation, one is struck by the film's ability to activate a transatlantic channel in a bidirectional logic which holds itself in a constant balance on a very thin thread between a fearless local dimension which emerges clearly from critical reception and the ambition to be global as well. Between the ability that is to manifest its larger-than-life nature and to produce a universal discourse on the degradation of Western civilization, between authorial and commercial, between realism and worldliness. It seems that, that the case of La Dolce Vita already challenges the three nodes highlighted by its assessor that we have seen before, through which the foreign film discourse in the post-war United States is articulated, namely the realist figure, the oppositional character to Hollywood, and the use of independent circuits. So if we see the case of La Dolce Vita, all of these three elements can be discussed. In the film, in fact, ends up using realism in a spectacular key, and if its circulation in the United States proceeds in a dimension of proximity rather than alternative to the Hollywood system, then it becomes an emblematic case of the way in which the circulation of foreign film in the United States changes. Beginning in the 60s, the American context becomes the privileged channel for the creation of a new authorial status that increasingly reconciles with the Hollywood framework. If the director thus assumes the status of an international star, the transformation of a certain type of cinema from national heritage to global canon is also a consequence of his operation. And the US success of La Dolce Vita testifies already at this stage a willingness to expand toward broader commercial prospects, not necessarily identifiable with those of a minority distinctive audience of moral intellectual extraction. Thus, the binarism that stigmatizes a sharp divide between the instances of art and those of the market, of the independent and mainstream circuits, beginning with La Dolce Vita, no longer seems to be effective, operative, and functional for reading the circulation of foreign film in the United States, at least in the terms long described, for example, by film historiography. And it is in a complementary direction to this that our third and final case study is built, namely that of the circulation of Italian-style westerns, particularly the first film of the genre to arrive in the United States, namely Sergio Leone's A Fistful of Dollars. Compared to the two cases previously analyzed, so a neorealist art house film such as Open City, an art house film that leaves the niche and enters the mainstream market such as La Dolce Vita, westerns are the quintessential popular genre being produced in 60s Italy. Due to the corresponding production collapse of Hollywood western in the early 60s, and the production contraction of the most popular genre in 50s Italy, namely the peplum, the so-called sword and sandals films, so set in ancient Roman costumes and shot on a very low budget, Italian producers found in the Western a genre of safe commercial exploitation. Between 64 and 75, of the 520 Westerns produced in Europe, about 450 are Italian, although most of these are co-production, but with Italian majority production. The majority of these are shot in Spain, the result of a very low-budget co-production agreements between Italy and other European countries, almost all of them, at least at an early stage, and for reasons of expediency, are sold as if they were American. So as you can see to this graphic, just in 1968 in Italy, we have 77 Westerns that were produced just in 1 year. And let's think about the fact that, for example, in 1964, Hollywood films, Hollywood westerns that were produced in Hollywood turned to, in the previous decade, they were a medium of 150 a year, and in 1964 they were, I think, maybe 11 or 12 just westerns in 1 year. So you can explain this boom looking at the trends in Hollywood productions. So talking about the fact that these films were sold as if they were American, such this operation, which often takes the contours of a recycling, if not outright plagiarism, is aimed first for all at a commercial logic, taking on only secondary implications that are also authorial. It is interesting, I think, to reason around the ways in which these remediations in Italian source of American imagery and iconography does find a diffusion back in the US market. So if you think about what André Bazin says about the Western genre, that is the American cinema par excellence, it is interesting to study, I think, the way in which this kind of Italian remediation of a Hollywood genre arrived back in the United States. Let us start just with a fact. When A Fistful of Dollars was released in Italian theaters, almost furtively in the summer of '64, Sergio Leone used a pseudonym, Bob Robertson, partly to pay homage to the stage name already used by his father, Roberto Roberti, so Robertson, son of Roberti, that was a famous director of the silent film era, and partly for the quirk of sounding American and thus allowing for greater distribution of his film in theaters among Italian moviegoers, still unaccustomed to the fact that Italian westerns could exist. Thanks to the word of mouth, it would eventually gross about 2.5 billion liras in Italy alone, establishing itself as the second highest grossing film of that season. It appears moreover paradigmatic that of the time of its American release, which would not occur until 1967, the director would appear under his name, Sergio Leone, and not under the Americanized pseudonym of Bob Robertson, as he had done, in order, in this case, to appear more international on the Italian market. In mid-January 1967, A Fistful of Dollars was released in the American theaters. Apparently, the release was delayed because of the lawsuit brought by Akira Kurosawa against Jolly Film, and thus indirectly against Sergio Leone, guilty of making an unauthorized remake of the Japanese film Yojimbo 61 by Kurosawa. The film's mode of release echoes, albeit in our terms, the saturation strategies already used for the peplum genre. United Artists decide on a wide and immediate distribution of the film, which is immediately scheduled in dubbed and not subtitled versions in as many as 75 theaters in the New York metropolitan area alone. The US version is slightly cut from the Italian version by about 10 minutes, stripped of some scenes deemed excessively violent and potentially problematic for the censor visa. In 1967 alone, the film grossed 4.5 million in the US theaters, reaching a total of 14.5 million by the end of 1969. Despite its widespread success, replicating what has already happened in Italy, the totality of American critics stand united against Leone's films. From the column of the New York Times, Bosley Crowther asked himself, what is happening to the Westerns? In other words, he is, and I quote, concerned that this genre, so resilient and enduring, is being subjected to a kind of modernization that might turn into something cruel and evil, end of quotation. The reason for this concern is precisely the success of A Fistful of Dollars. Leone's film, that is, and I quote again, full of violence, shootings and bloodshed, this, along with the anti-hero's attitude of cynical and selfish disdain, represents a violation of the happy romantic myth that has made this genre popular over the years. Thus, and I quote again, although A Fistful of Dollars is currently very popular and will encourage a slew of imitation, it is likely to produce permanent damage, end of quotation. Even the Los Angeles Times noted how, and I quote, "The only reason one can imagine considering this film is to satisfy the eventual desire to study the changes undergone by the American Western after an Italian director's reworking." End of quotation. Finally, in a cross-cutting reflection on the 68 production boom of what are already being called spaghetti westerns, a New York Times columnist refers to A Fistful of Dollars as, and I quote, "one of the meanest, most brutal and vomitous film ever made." End of quotation. Leone's subsequent film also received similar interest from American audiences, coupled with a very poor response. Again, across the board from critics, Crowder, this time about For a Few Dollars More, which was released in theater in July '67, will note how Leone's primary goal is, and I quote, "to fill the screen with violence, with men chasing other men like animals, guns firing, bullets whistling, and bodies collapsing in droves in spanks." The director is also accused of producing films that are, and I quote, "socially decadent and dangerous like the LSD." End of quotation. Renata Adler will also speak of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in terms of the most expensive, pedantic, and repellent film in the history of this genre. And finally, Vincent Canby wrote on Once Upon a Time in the West as either, and I quote, "a film for the indifferent consumer or for the amateur, urging viewers who find themselves in between these two categories to stay home." The three films will gross $15 million, $25 million, and $6 million respectively in American theaters. So if American audiences therefore seem very intrigued by the resignification accomplished by Leone, this encroachment is viewed by critics with concern and suspicion. It is not surprising then the little critical attention devoted to the spaghetti westerns that would be released in the following years in the United States, signed by directors such as Sergio Corbucci, Sergio Sollima, or Enzo G. Castellari. After all, many of these films circulated in the United States mainly on neighborhood theaters, so smaller movie theaters located in the suburbs of large cities or small towns, frequented mainly by the American working classes thanks to the much cheaper prices of both mainstream and art house circuits. Considered most as B-movies, they will be re-evaluated by critics thanks to television in 80s and 90s, only in the phase of recovery by established, for example, by American auteurs such as Martin Scorsese or Quentin Tarantino as well. And the reason for this lukewarm critical reception by Americans are probably to be found in Leone's continual surpassing of the classic Western, with which he opens an intertextual dialogue made up of quotations, reference, and homages, never, however, adopting an authorial, canonical, or cinephile gaze, but rather an ironic, cynical, and desecrating one. Leone's goal is to reconsider the Western as a genre to be emptied, a device to be deconstructed, a container to be filled with artificial cliché in which the relational dynamics between copy and original, high and low, author and commercial system are constantly brought into play and discussed. Perhaps the core in which Leone's production is based lies precisely in the definition of an art house popular cinema, and I'm quoting Christian Uva, in which the director's peculiar poetics and also his style are rooted in a narrative horizon of a popular kind. In other words, Italian Western does not work for the critic in the US because they manifest as something other than the expectations of critics, who are still too anchored in a certain imagery of European cinema, that one of Neorealism and Fellini as well, understood above all in his anti-classical authorial vehicle. And Leone is something really, really different between these two kinds of cinema, so it's really difficult for them to read what he's doing. Although Western films do not immediately enter the canon of Italian cinema, the reprisal in recent years should nevertheless be traced back to new authorial attitudes emerging directly from the American film industry in a historical phase in which it becomes possible to reshape Italian Western as they had reshaped the classical Western. In the second part of the decade, after realizing the possibility of incorporating these characters of modernity brought to the United States by Italian and European cinema, and I was thinking about all, not just to Italian cinema, but even to the Nouvelle Vague cinema coming from France, or even Swedish cinema, for example, Ingmar Bergman films, and even Japanese cinema. That is maybe the fourth more important cinema in the foreign cinema in the United States in those years. Hollywood began to actively collaborate, for example, with European authors and with Italian authors as well. One only has to think first of the three Hollywood films by Michelangelo Antonioni, perhaps the most radical Italian author, signing a contract with a major such as MGM for three films, Blow Up, Zabriskie Point, and The Passenger, Professor Reporter. When the American market realized that it is possible to incorporate the traditional characters of the foreign film within the system, we assist, for example, to new Hollywood experience. The so-called Hollywood Renaissance in the late 60s and early 70s, not surprisingly, corresponds to a irreversible crisis of Italian art house cinema, which continues to produce niche films where niche circuits are disappearing. But above all, when art house cinema started to be done by Americans, and much better than us, just think of authors like, for example, Scorsese, Coppola, and Cimino, who are all Italian-American directors. During the 80s and the 90s, we will have several attempts to revive this kind of lifeless body, that of Italian author cinema, by trying to repurpose, through the form of a proper Americanization, content that has now lost all the distinctive features of foreign film, realism, the opposition to Hollywood, the art house circuits that were mentioned earlier. One only has to think to Italian films distributed, for example, by Weinstein's brother, Miramax, such as Tornatore, Nuovo Cinema Paradiso, Salvatore's Mediterraneo, Troisi's Il Postino, or Benigni's La Vita è Bella, where we assist to a kind of Americanization of Italian cinema and a will to domesticate in certain way the original characters of foreign films. It would be nice to have a discussion for each of these other cases, but I think I've overused your attention enough and we are running out of time, so thank you so much for listening.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's a great talk, and it's a great journey in the way, you know, as we were saying, sort of like the notion itself of Italian cinema is shaped. So, for those of you who are watching us from home, I was saying that it's a great talk, and it really helps us understand how the notion of Italian cinema is shaped not just, you know, internally, but it's really shaped also externally by all these discourses through distribution, the changing of language around the films, the changing of an idea of what an auteur, or the creation of the idea of what the auteur is, and sort of then the way that to push through history and through the institutions that really support it, sort of like the Oscar, the awards, and so on and so forth, the film festivals. Before I sort of like I open it to the floor, I would like you to perhaps, you know, think out loud with me about precisely the question of language, you know, the creation, because you pinpointed early on, you said like, well, this is where we see the word neorealism, for instance, be used as sort of like, you know, measuring stick against everything else, against, you know, all this cinema emanating from Italy or Italian co-productions and so on and so forth, you know, need to somehow sort of like live up to the experience of neorealism. And as you were saying, like, it's a term that's bandied about in all the film reviews that we read today. But actually, this is really, really true. If you read the reviews for Richard Rohrbacher's La Chimera, you know, the film just came out. Neorealism is all over the reviews, of course. It just becomes this kind of constant thing. And you and I were discussing how also in academia, that has become, you know, a contentious term where you're like, well, everything that Italian cinema has produced is measured against this, also discursively. Well, is there still a relationship between critics and academics and filmmakers? Is it still as porous as it used to be during the years of Neorealism, and so on and so forth. So I'm wondering, like, what is the real role of language, or literally what we call things? You know, the words that we use to talk about them. And you pointed out also, you know, that we were already using spaghetti western in the late 1960s, which is really, really early.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, you know, and here I'm hearing nostalgia somewhere, nostalgic Italian films, and then you look at the tone of these, and they're extreme. You know, a lot of them are period pieces like Mediterraneo. A lot of them, or La Vita Bella. A lot of them are nostalgic. They're thinking about this idea of Italy, right? That circulates not just internally, but mostly abroad. So I'm wondering, like, you know, would you entertain this idea, like, would you think out loud?
Yeah. I was thinking about two possible ways in which to answer your question. The first is about the fact that when Neorealism became sort of a critical category in the American press, in the American critics, I think that we can say that the legitimacy is done in a certain way. Because these films try to be much more, try to work on the fact that they are opposite, in open opposition to Hollywood films. So in a certain way, Neorealism became this kind of counterpart to meet something that is not Hollywood similar in several ways, in a certain way. But at the same time, after the time, so starting from the 60s, where and when this term is being used, several articles by American critics and arriving till today, I think that also we can say that is a really huge simplification. It's really it's something that go in the other direction of complexity. So when you are not able to understand something, you have to call to terms and things that you already know, for example. And as for in the case of Alicia Rohrwacher's films, but even, for example, Jonas Carpignano's films, but even Garrone's films, that I think that they try to open a dialogue with the cinema of the past, but at the same time, it's hard to say that they made Neorealist films, even because they work on the, for example, subject of, for Alicia Rohrwacher, something called like magic Neorealism, recalling the magic realism of Fellini, that maybe it became another critical category. But at the same time, if we see to these films, to these new Italian films, it's hard to say that they are much more in dialogue with Neorealism rather than with, for example, global art cinema. But
there's a tension between the
there's a tension, but I think also that's interesting because maybe without Neorealism we couldn't have now even the concept of global art cinema. So Neorealism influenced also this idea of art cinema going globally. Yes, but it could be a really, really complex issue, I think, even to discuss. But yeah, I think that maybe two questions to answer.
No, I think it's a great answer, and I think this, identifying precisely this tension is also something that happens in scholarship. I mean, a few years ago, I think in 2012, we had that Global Neorealism book. I think it was was it Luchino, which really looked at sort of like the way Italian Neorealism participated sort of in the creation of global cinema, as you were saying, because a lot of global cinema distributed then, mostly in the global north, is asked to measure up to Italian Neorealism, which was sort of like the first wave, of a national cinema that was somehow different, from not only aesthetically but also in terms of like production practices and so on and so forth from the Hollywood studio system. So a lot of sort of Iranian cinema and whatnot, is asked to sort of like measure, Chinese cinema is sort of like measure up, aesthetically, but also in terms of production practices. And then you have, the Italian auteurs that you mentioned, and, going back to Rohrbacher, there's a very strong relationship with Fellini there, undeniably, from an aesthetic standpoint. I mean, she calls her characters like Gelsomini, right? Literally, she's acknowledging it.
Yeah.
But yet, in terms of distribution, it's part of a completely different system that relies, of course, on festival exposure and whatnot. And that has already sort of much the way the Hollywood studio system exists now. You have the festival circuit and the art house cinema. That's a very sort of a codified way of presenting films. So it's like, I think it's great to underscore that how they live in. There's the constant tension between the two.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No. I was thinking about the fact that both Rohrbacher and Campignano, for example, used this kind of cultural mediator, like, for example, Martin Scorsese, who is the executive producer of some of their films. And Martin Scorsese is maybe the most influential director in terms of the building of sort of a canon on Italian cinema, using Neorealism even, and using other types of films, even because he used to appear in every DVD copy of restoration of several Italian films, talking about the importance of Maisarum, Open City, La Dolce Vita, things like that in the history of Italian cinema. So it could be even interesting to think about how this cultural mediation by Scorsese is also something that deals with Neorealism as well.
Yeah, from the documentary, right? From My Journey in Italian Cinema, but also to the editorial. He's actually just published an editorial recently about, I think it was about Fellini, and interestingly, the letterboxed thing. So it's interesting that you bring up, Scorsese. I don't know if you're familiar, but it's sort of like the community of film aficionados and cinephiles sometimes relies to apps to socialize. There's sort of like social media apps through films. And one of them is called Letterboxd, where they invite people to curate lists, where they compile lists and offer essentially opinions on current and past cinema. And when Scorsese's list dropped, coincidentally or simultaneously with the release of Killers of the Flower Moon, his latest film, it made a huge splash because suddenly we have this octogenarian director who makes this 3.5-hour movie, rejecting streaming services, but asking them to be first shown in the films, and then at the same time, so almost seeming passé, but at the same time, then intervening on social media and promoting all of this global cinema that a lot of people probably is not on their radar to major movie to even moviegoers. So again, with all constantly thinking about that tension between tradition and innovation, well, thank you. I'm just going to open it to the floor because I'm sure there are a lot of questions, and I can see that our chair already has a question.
Just because I'm sure also good. Should we take a look at what's happening downstairs so that everybody? So that I have a lot of questions, so I will spare you most of them, and just want to follow up on what we were talking about. I'm interested in asking you to what extent, on the one hand, categories like neorealism can become a shorthand to interpret Italian cinema, but to what extent they also become a tool, not even just to promote Italian film, but also to think about films that are marketable to a certain audience. I mean, the thing, many years ago, as a graduate student, I was teaching all kinds of things, not necessarily in my bailiwick, but I had to do something on Cino Paradiso, and I remember giving it the title of history of an unannounced Oscar, and it seemed, when I saw it, it struck me as a film that had been designed with the Academy in mind, right? Not just because it's a celebration of cinema, but because of the way it tries to recreate, from the peasant Italy, the sweaty bodies, and the thing, I think something similar happened with The Postman, and perhaps even with Life is Beautiful, right? Kind of rural pre or post-war Italy with all the physicality and the cute characters. There was a way in which the I don't know, I don't want to ramble on, but I'm wondering if it's not just the critics who are using the shorthand, but also perhaps producers and even directors.
Yeah. This is a very great point, and I think that, for example, one distributors like Weinstein, Miramax work mostly on this idea because of they try to take Italian films coming from Italy with lots of box office, and they try to grow this kind of films for the American markets, even working on re-editing of several things inside the films, and obviously working on a promotional approach that took a lot, for example, from nostalgia, from the idea of not just cinema of the past, but even coming from an idea of Italy from the past. So all the peasant environments, all the rural things. For example, you mentioned films that, for example, they worked mostly on this idea of Italy that was also built through cinema in the United States. So in certain way, we can say that all these promotional strategies try to use the Italian cinema of the past, but at the same time trying to be much more fitable for American audiences of the 80s and for the 90s. So it's a kind of a sort of Americanization of Italian auteur cinema, trying to mix this idea of the cinema of the past and working on, for example, the mainstream circuits, the Academy Awards, distributing film dubbed and not subtitled as it were during Neorealism or during Italian cinema of the 60s. Yes, but I think that this is a really, really crucial point in terms of this kind of idea to use not just in critical terms, but even for the market. And it is a very good point, but it can maybe, I think, with Weinstein's experience of 80s and 90s.
Yeah, if I just add just a slight point, and it's really enduring too. I mean, I recently, a couple of years ago, not just because of the title, but also because I had at the time my 12-year-old to watch Luca. It's basically reimagining with this kind of Hollywood idea of cinema in the 1950s Italy in a cartoon. It was just astonishing how that mythology from the Vespas to the the peasants and all that.
You have even a poster from La Strada.
Right, that's right. Yeah.
In the film. Yeah. I saw it. I noticed it just because I had 3 years old daughter, so I've seen the film I think maybe 50 times. So, and the 30th time I saw the poster, I said, "Hey, thank you, Anna." Because I noticed it. Please.
I grew up in Hollywood in the 50s, and television was so dominant in that time that it was so refreshing to hear things coming in a completely different way from European cinema. As many of my friends were in the industry, and of course they had all the promotions, and you'd see these movies on television. They were all cheerful according to the code, and sort of hand washed. And you go to European film, and there was a lot of dirt, there was sex, and there was different languages. And as compared with television, it was so refreshing for a teenager. And I think the opportunity for these European films in all these different languages was so much better when television had sort of sanitized the world of entertainment for us in California.
Can I ask you, where did you see the films?
Sorry?
Where did you see the films? Like, where did you see the films?
All our houses in Hollywood. And they were, of the people that were there were almost entirely people from the industry and teenagers that wanted something other than what they watched on their parents' TV.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you so much.
So, in today's perspective, where does Italian film stand as far as even less distribution? Because there's very little Italian movies
Now,
nowadays
okay.
that actually
Mhm.
come to market.
Mhm.
So do we take a Miramax company again to bring Italian movie to what it used to be?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I think that maybe the problem now is that we continue to this kind of production that is based on adventurous. On one way, in Italy, we make films that are auteur films for film festivals and are thought with the idea to promote them on an international level. And in the other, we have domestic films, which are much more comedies that used to work inside our market. But if you see at the film industry, I think in the last 20 years, all the films that used to circulate, that used to went well abroad, are all films that try to work about a mixture between a kind of a middle grow approach between art cinema and popular cinema. This came, I think, mostly from France and even from UK. So now, if you look to this kind of film, to the foreign films that came out, for example, in the United States, you have this kind of films that could fit perfectly for both the mainstream markets and even the art house markets. Even if you have not so much art house circuits that could bring this kind of cinema and even show to this kind of intellectual and elite audiences. So you have now different audiences rather than the elite intellectual audiences that you have, for example, in 40s or in 60s. And you have not circuits, this kind of circuits yet. So maybe we didn't realize yet that we are producing kind of cinema for a market that it is not live. I don't know if I answered to your question, and I don't know if I want to answer to the question.
No,
if we
I
need
know.
another minute, but I totally understand the point.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we haven't really, well, there's an elephant in the room, right, which are streaming platforms,
Yeah.
Yes.
which of course provide, a different model of distribution,
Yes.
distribute different qualities of products. And I'm glad you brought up the idea of middle ground here, because that's kind of where what the market they created essentially is predicated on the middle ground. So like a middle ground that would be palatable to both, the average sort of like moviegoer and the Academy member.
Yeah.
Well, of course, they would lobby,
Yeah.
in very unsavory ways, and we know the history. But yeah, I think that's probably the next case study for you both.
Yeah. Why not?
Okay, we are out of time, but there is a lovely reception waiting for us on the second floor, so I hope you can join us. And once again, join me in thanking Damiano.
Thank you.